Okay, so the question becomes, is dyslexia counted as a disability? Well, okay, so it's not a simple black and white yes or no. We have to take in language, law, and context. So first of all, language. Now, depending on where you are in the world, dyslexia is described differently. So the American-based International Dyslexia Association describes dyslexia as a learning disability. The Rose Report describes it as a learning difficulty. The British Dyslexia Association recently used to describe it as a learning difference. And recently there's been something called the Delphi Report into the definition of dyslexia in the United Kingdom that uses words like difficulty, weakness, disorder, etc. But in Britain, you'll notice the Rose Report, the British Dyslexia Association, and the Delphi definition, they don't use the word disability, whereas they do in America. So linguistically, depending on where you are in the world, whether dyslexia is a disability partly depends upon the language that the definition that you use is couched in. Next, there's the law. So, one of the questions we might ask is what laws are relevant to dyslexia when we're asking whether it's a disability? One of the most important laws in Britain is the Equality Act, and dyslexia is covered by the Equality Act. Now, this is quite complex. So, in the Equality Act, if you discriminate against somebody with dyslexia, this is a legal matter. And so you can be prosecuted for not putting in an appropriate accommodation or not providing the proper screen readers that may be required. But that in itself doesn't mean that dyslexia is a disability. So for instance, covered in the Equality Act, things such as, or categories such as women. So you'd give women single-sex spaces, or you'd give them sanitary bins or something along those lines, and you would never class women as a category of disability. Same with different languages. So if you have a multilingual environment and you only produce information in English, then you're discriminating under the Equality Act. So simply having dyslexia as counted as within the Equality Act doesn't in itself categorize it as a disability. However, dyslexia is referred to as a disability in the Equality Act. Now, this is really important. So, where dyslexia is categorized as a disability, this means that it is enshrined in law under disability law, and there are disability rights associated with dyslexia. This is very important. However, what we then do is we look at the definition of disability as described by British law and by the Equality Act. So the definition of disability is essentially, to simplify it, a long-term condition that negatively affects your day-to-day activities. So a long-term condition that negatively affects your day-to-day activities. This is interesting because it turns out that not everybody who's dyslexic has a long-term condition that negatively affects their day-to-day activities. Some dyslexics function perfectly well. And so one of the things we have to ask is your dyslexia negatively affecting your day-to-day activities in a long-term basis? And this would categorize it as a disability. Now, not that long ago, the British Dyslexia Association would have said that round about 10%, they now say about 15% of the population is dyslexic, but they'd say about 4% of the population is dyslexic such that it's categorized as a disability. That is, such that it's a long-term condition that negatively affects your day-to-day activities. This then brings us on to the third part, which is context. Because, of course, depending on the context you're in, it might or might not negatively affect your day-to-day activities. So, for instance, there have been certain legal cases where somebody has said, this person has discriminated against me on grounds of my dyslexia, and the law has said, absolutely true, that the employer has discriminated against you on grounds of your dyslexia. But there have been other cases where people have said the law, that this employer has discriminated against me on grounds of my dyslexia, and the law has said, no, that's not the case, because your dyslexia has not negatively affected you in your day-to-day activities within this job. And so essentially what's happening is dyslexia can be counted as a disability contextually. And this is what we've got to understand. So, is dyslexia a disability? Well, the language of dyslexia in some countries, for instance the United States, states categorically dyslexia is a disability. In the United Kingdom, it doesn't. The second thing is that dyslexia is covered by the Equality Act, but that in itself doesn't mean that it's a disability. However, the Equality Act does state that dyslexia can be counted or is counted under disability. But this is really for a cover-all. This is really because it wants to cover all its bases. When it comes down to it, it's context that's key. So there may be context in which your dyslexia is disabling, and there may be context in which your dyslexia is not disabling. And so when we ask whether dyslexia is a disability, we have to look at three things. We have to look first at language, second at the law, and perhaps most importantly, at context. Thank you very much. If you'd like to share this video, I'd be very happy. And if you want to get into the conversation and say whether you think it is a disability or isn't a disability, I'd love to hear from you.